This is the story of a college student named Yuya, who had been summoned by a goddess and only hoped for the typical no-brainer ending of every Isekai hero tale, where he'd return to his boring life after defeating the dragon she had summoned him to defeat. After he was forced to stay back and defeat another evil god, the goddess finally let Yuya return to his world, but insisted that he complete his farewell ritual first. Yuya reported his victory to the royal family and celebrated with his comrades, but as he packed his bags, a furry burst into tears because she couldn't bear to watch him go. It was understandably difficult for her because Yuya and his party members rescued her after she lost her family to bandits, and Yuya formed a part of the second home she ever knew. A maid, Eris, informed him that the preparations for the ritual were complete, and also expressed her disappointment at the fact that Yuya would be leaving without fulfilling her wishes. Following that, the king begged Yuya to stay back and even offered him his flat as a whiteboard daughter, the second princess, and her maid. Also, the crown Prince Leon, along with his younger brothers, solemnly bade Yuya farewell because he was like a brother to them. Before leaving, Yuya's final request was for the royal family to take good care of Tia. After that, he met with the princess, Saint Mel, who thanked him for sacrificing his own life to save her world and swore to protect what he had so dearly fought for with her life. Even though she had hoped to get cozy with him before letting him go, she accepted what was and bade him farewell before performing the rite of return. In a few seconds, Yuya found himself back in his world and found out that the goddess had returned him to the exact date and time that he had left, as she had promised. Since he was in school, he decided to head home, but on the way, a girl named Akin, who had been his friend from childhood, called out to him. She noticed he was acting weird and almost like a different person, but Yuya tried to dismiss her worries. However, she was under the suspicion that he was weird because he now had a girlfriend, but with the same mouth she accused him of having one, she cursed at him jokingly, saying he had been doomed to die single since he had an allergy to aura. However, he reminded her she didn't have a boyfriend either, and decided he was gonna grab lunch and head home as he had originally intended. Akin followed him to grab lunch, but still noticed more strangeness in his behavior and a coincidental change in his physique, as he looked 10 times hotter than the formless pig she had always known. Yuya suggested that perhaps she had fallen for him, but that immediately disgusted her so much that she wanted to pop his eyes with a can. However, she surprisingly noticed that tears were dripping down his face and asked him why he was crying, but the idiot blamed it all on mustard, even though she wouldn't buy it. Finally arriving at his home, Yuya was glad to find his home exactly as he recalled. Unfortunately, no one was there because his mom was on the night shift, his sister was at her school club, and his dad had moved away for his job somewhere on a different continent. As he opened the door of his dark room, he turned on the light but noticed, quite strangely, that he had unconsciously used a familiar hand motion to create light, and that only meant one thing. He had returned to his world with his magical powers. Yuya was shocked and confused at the discovery that he could still use magic, so he tried out other forms of magic, such as fire and wind magic, which both worked successfully, just as the light magic had. He remembered the gift his parents gave him for getting into college and tried appraising it with his magic, but disappointedly realized that he had been scammed with a fake Roly. At the same time, Yuya confirmed that he could still access his status window, and the inventory window still worked. He realized that he hadn't returned the holy sword belonging to the kingdom he had saved. Again, Yuya realized that his own life was the exact opposite of every typical Isekai story out there. He had expected that after returning to his world, he would lose his powers, forget everything that happened, and live a happy life, but that was the exact opposite of what he was experiencing. At first, he was just chilling as a college student when he was summoned by Saint Mel, and then the goddess talked him into doing her dirty work. He spent a whole year training in both martial arts and magic, and with the help of his comrades, wiped the floor with the Demon King. However, the mastermind turned out to be the evil god Vilio, and Yuya still took him down. Everything he had done led him to his current situation, and he was completely clueless about why he still had magic, so he could only assume that the stupid goddess was playing some trick again. But since he couldn't ask her, he could never know for sure. Even if he wanted to restrain himself from using magic, he had gotten so used to performing his daily activities with magic in the other kingdom. So since he couldn't change anything, he decided to make sure at least that no one found out. Coincidentally, his sister, Ayumi, popped into his room to ask for lunch. She also noticed that he seemed different, although she blamed it on cheap crack. In the morning, Yuya decided not to attend lectures but to walk deep into the mountains so he could take a break from school and be somewhere he wouldn't be seen. He also noticed that he had been hiking at a pretty fast pace, but seemed not to be tired and blamed his body for malfunctioning. However, he accidentally created a huge crack in the ground when he kicked it lightly, and at that point, he was questioning whether he was human at all. He cast a fire spell, an ice spell, and a water spell, and all three worked normally. Next, he tested his inventory and found that it worked, as it had provided him with his holy sword. Finally, he tried to summon a familiar, and it worked, bringing forth his very first familiar, a shadow wolf that could understand the human language. Since he was done testing his summon feature, he let his wolf return and walked into town. On the way, he realized he needed some clothes but was super broke, so he went to purchase a scratch lottery. The salesgirl presented him with 3 lottery tickets, and he used his appraisal skill to estimate their worth. Afterwards, he picked one that had 50,000 worth of yen and cashed out his win. In his heart, Yuya felt like he was a low-key thief, although he couldn't blame himself for possessing magical powers. On his way out, he saw Akin together with a girl, Nana, both of whom were trying to shrug some idiots off their shoulders. When the girls spotted Yuya, Akin hid behind him, so one of the fools challenged him, asking him what the heck his problem was and why he was getting in their way. However, Yuya checked the guy's status and found that his stats were embarrassingly low, even for a prototype loser. He told the boys to be good and brought out some weird object, which he placed in his hands, squishing it in front of their eyes. He then told them to leave the girls alone, and they instantly left. But instead of being happy, Akin glared at him and asked him what he did. All Yuya told her was that he explained the situation to the boys, and they were super understanding. But when she refused to believe him, he told her that he had given the boys the name of someone who was quite notorious, and that was what scared them off. She finally let him off the hook, and both girls offered to go shopping with him. Afterwards, they had fun shopping, and he treated them to dinner. But on their way home, they noticed that someone had been hit in a vehicle accident. Yuya immediately told Ayumi and Nana to call the police and an ambulance, while Akin should keep an eye on the driver. He rushed to attend to the victim and used his magical skill, Conceal Presence, which made him invisible and unnoticeable to anyone. Unfortunately, the people around the victim were taking pictures instead of helping her, even though she was unconscious. He noticed she had a skull fracture, but there was no apparent wound damage, so he could still help her. Even though he couldn't heal her completely, he could make the wounds less deep so they wouldn't scar, and so he used his heal feature. Afterwards, she twitched, and he reassured her that everything would be okay and that the ambulance would soon arrive. He lifted his console presence still, but was looking for Akin when he noticed her yelling at the driver. The idiot claimed he was still recovering from shock from the accident, but she ordered him to call an ambulance because the other victim was in an unconscious state. But when the idiot told her to mind her business, Yuya couldn't hold himself any longer and jerked up the guy by his collar, pointing out how dumb and irresponsible he sounded. Akin begged him to let him go, after which the ambulance finally arrived. When it was all over, they bid each other goodbye, but as he left, Akin seemed to have more to tell him but told him not to mind her. Later, Nana asked her what she planned to say to him, and Akin pointed out that there was a strange light around Akin when he was helping the accident victim. Nana said she wasn't looking at Yuya when he was helping the girl, and that Akin might have just been seeing things. Nevertheless, Akin stood by what she saw in her own mind. In that moment, Nana praised Yuya in his absence for looking so cool, and she asked Akin to gist her all about that hug. Flustered, Akin denied ever hugging Yuya, but Nana couldn't be easily convinced and even invited her over for a sleepover so she'd spill the tea. The next day, Yuya noticed that his shirt was still too tight, and all he wanted to do was rip it off. It had been 2 days since the accident, and the girl who had been hit had to be admitted for some days in the hospital, although she would be allowed to resume school the following week. The driver who hit her was unfortunately let go because he was sober at the time of the accident. To deliver justice in his own way, Yuya cursed the guy, bestowing upon him the curse of diarrhea whenever he would ever get excited. Anyway, it was time for him to put everything behind him, as he would be attending his part-time job. He showed up, and the manager asked him to work the front. It had been 2 weeks since his last shift in that role, but in reality, it had been over 3 years for Yuya, so he wondered if he could still do the job. However, his manager was losing her mind over the fact that he was shirtless, claiming it was because his work clothes didn't fit him anymore. The lady trembled as she selected a shirt from the pile. Although in her head, Mizu only wondered when Yuya became so ripped. Later, he worked hard at his job, but even Mizu could tell he was putting in so much effort. This was all thanks to the fact that Yuya's body was stronger, and he could actually do more than he could before. While he was working, one guy and his gang got too rowdy, so Mizu told them to tone it down and refrain from bothering the other customers. However, the guy said the place was practically empty, and there was no reason for him to keep quiet. So Yuya stepped in, saying that if they couldn't keep the noise down, he would politely ask them to leave. The idiots claimed customers were always right and deserved to be served, but Yuya said their restaurant didn't have time to serve losers, and as such, the bozo and his puppets should get out. The fool asked if Yuya was looking for a fight, so he simply activated his intimidation skill, and all of them staggered backwards, losing their loud mouths and confidence after only one look from Yuya. Thereafter, he handed them their bill, and they politely settled immediately, swaying away like the wasted fools they were. Mizu later asked him if they had done anything to him, and then started crying, saying she should have been the one to take care of them. However, he told her everything turned out fine, and he would only have to go clean up their little mess. Ever since Yuya returned to his world, he had been bored and quite exhausted, so he walked into the woods and in a cave met a dragon who was his familiar. Earlier that day, Yuya had wondered about what to do with his sacred blade, the weapon he had been given by the king when he was a hero. Before leaving their world, he wanted to give it back before returning to Japan, but forgot it in his inventory. Even though he had dealt with the biggest threats, which were the evil god and the demon king, there were still little tiny demons roaming about here and there. However, Yuya knew he wouldn't be able to use it much in his own world, so he planned to return it at all costs. He later walked into the forest, remembering that he had earlier summoned his wolf, who seemed to have returned to the other side, so he planned to return the sword blade by summoning someone else. In the same location where he summoned the wolf, he summoned Layla, his familiar, who was a dragon. Layla was upset with her master for returning to his world, but was surprised that his summoning magic could reach across worlds. She asked what he had summoned her to do for him, and so he said that he had borrowed something but forgot to return it back, and he would like her to help him return it to the royal palace in Ariana's. Yuya wasn't comfortable sending her on that errand because Layla preferred to avoid interacting with humans, being the enemy of all social introverts. Most of his familiars he made by forming a contract with them by besting them in battle, but Layla's contract wasn't an average contract, but rather an initially beneficial relationship through summoning and exchange of information. Obviously, he couldn't order her to do anything and could only ask nicely. She said she had no issue helping him but wanted something in return, which was that she wanted to see his world for herself and experience it with her own eyes. However, Yuya said there was no issue, only that her form might be a problem. Surprisingly, Layla transformed into her human version, shocking Yuya with the size of those planets, and all he wanted her to do was shake them to the max. Before embarking on their exploration journey, Yuya warned her not to let anyone know she was from another world, because the inhabitants of this world were unaware of other worlds. She hopped on his bike and experienced the beautiful, smooth roads of Japan and took in its stunning scenery, thanks to the advancements in technology. She also couldn't get enough of the food, especially cake parfaits, and if she had to burn down a kingdom or two to get those, she wouldn't think twice. He begged her not to eat like she had 10 stomachs because he was just a broke college student. However, she asked him if she could give him one of her scales so he could sell it for money. In the end, he had to drag her out of the place, and since she had had her fun, Yuya said it was time for them to go, as he had to attend lectures. However, the girl said she would join him in class, but Yuya was obviously not comfortable with the idea, so she decided to explore the town while waiting for him. However, when he realized that she could spend his entire generation's savings and his trust fund, he decided to allow her to accompany him to class, although he begged her to behave herself. Walking into the university halls, Layla said the university was as large as a palace on the other side, and their population of about 2,000 students was about the population of a rural village. As he was getting in, he was asked for his identification at the reception, and then realized that he didn't get Layla any proof of identity, so he used her guild card and it worked for her. Yuya was shocked, wondering if guild cards worked in every world, but she told him not to be dumb because she had only used magic to make the receptionist see what she wanted to see. They gave them a visitor's pass, but as soon as they walked towards class, they bumped into Akin, who looked wilder than a ferocious tigress in heat. She asked him who his lady friend was and was even more shocked to hear Layla address Yuya as her master. So Yuya introduced Layla as a friend of his dad, who happened to be in Japan, and asked him to show her around. Still, Akin wasn't convinced and asked why Layla was calling him her master, so he simply said that Layla was still learning the language and used old-fashioned words to express herself. Akin showed Yuya aside and introduced herself, saying she had never seen a lady so beautiful, while Layla said she had heard so much about Akin. Yuya usually complained that Akin was bad company, and he had been trying to get rid of her since middle school. At that point, Yuya already knew his time on Earth was up, and Akin squeezed his shoulders, saying she would follow him into his classroom. She nicely showed Layla the way to the cafeteria and other parts of the school, but somehow around that period, a guy named Akio asked Yuya to introduce the hottie he brought with him. Akio was a third-year law student whom Yuya had met through their towering club. From the day he started uni, he spent every second on his bike and failed his first year so fast that he almost got suspended. So Yuya warned the bozo that if he kept speaking in that manner, he would fail school that year too. Eventually, he introduced Akio to Layla, saying he looked like a playboy but was actually pretty nice. Almost immediately, Akio gushed over Layla, saying she was absolutely stunning, and he felt sorry for every other girl there. But right then, Akin asked him what he meant by that statement, and he was forced to eat up his words. From there, more guys joined them, asking if they could join them, but Akio sent them on their way, saying they could flip their antennas or something. They both got into a fight, and Yuya immediately said that they should leave him with Layla because they were together. The fatso offered to show her around campus and even told Yuya to go on his way, so Yuya could tell that the idiot was trying to threaten him. When Layla had seen enough nonsense, she grabbed the hamster's face, asking him what exactly he was planning to do to Yuya. After much pleading, Yuya convinced her to let the fool live and turned his attention to the fool, telling him he was a little out of her league. Akin, curious as ever, asked Yuya what was up with Layla and that tremendous amount of strength, so he simply said the girl worked out a lot. They bade Akio goodbye, while he begged relentlessly for Layla's number. In the end, Yuya was worn out because he had a more eventful day than he had bargained for, and had yet even to give Layla the sword he wanted to give her. They arrived at his house, and Layla said she wanted to meet his family and also whispered in his ears that if anything strange were to happen, she would use magic to make it go away. Surprisingly, Yuya's sister was already holding a banner welcoming Layla to Japan, and she said that Akin had texted her that Yuya would be bringing in a lady friend. They had dinner together, but later they all went to bed while Akin couldn't get over Layla's extra-large airbags. On the other hand, Yuya roamed around in his bed, wondering whether Layla was okay. And indeed, she was, as she was getting a barrage of questions from Akin pertaining to what her relationship with Yuya was. But Layla said that their souls were bonded to one another, although it wasn't in a romantic sense. However, she did find him attractive as a man and liked him, although she wasn't particularly sure in what way she liked him. Yuya's sister told Akin that she had now found a rival, but Akin denied anything of that nature. So Layla asked her what her relationship was with Yuya. Akin only said that they were friends, but Layla outrightly said that it seemed both Akin and Yuya had once exchanged juices. It was obvious that Layla hadn't come for peace, but to create violence. The poor Yuya was trying his best to eavesdrop on their conversation, but could hear nothing at all, although he was quite confident that no one would suspect anything. He was still worried and checked in on the girls, asking if they needed anything, but they told him to get out and stop interrupting their girl talk. Eventually, all he prayed for was that the holy sword would make it back okay. Now this is the story of how Uma and Layla met. Before their meeting, Layla had always stayed alone in that cave, and no one ever set foot there for obvious reasons, so she spent her days slumbering away. Time flowed slowly until about 2 years ago when she left her cave. It all began when she met Yuya and his party, who appeared to her in her cave. Still, she was never fond of humans because they were greedy, arrogant, and violent, and so she sent them off, threatening to eat them if they wouldn't leave. However, Yuya told her that he needed her help to protect the kingdom from the Demon King, but Layla refused to help them because, to her, humans and monsters were the same, and she had no intention of standing between them. So Yuya offered to complete any task she assigned to him, and if he succeeded, it meant he won, but if he failed, then Layla won. If he lost, she could do whatever she wanted to with him, but if he won, she would have to help them just for a little while. Layla burst out laughing, asking why he was willing to go to such extremes. So Yuya shared that the goddess Valianes summoned him to protect their land, and he was only trying to do his best so he could go back to his own home. Layla told Yuya to abandon the people of that world because they weren't his concern, and there were also other ways he could return home. But he said that even though he was upset with the goddess for summoning him, he could never return to peace after abandoning everyone he had met in his new world. His speech made her consider his offer, and so she said he should subdue her by force so he could prove himself to her. If he succeeded, she would acknowledge him as her master and lend him her power. Yuya's teammates begged him not to try because he was no match for a dragon, but Yuya excitedly said it was his honor to fight against Layla. During the fight, Yuya struggled over and over again, captivating Layla with the sincerity in his eyes. After their back and forth, Layla declared Yuya the winner of their wager. She said she won't serve him unconditionally, but he would be her master for a while. She was impressed by how relentless he was, even though he knew how difficult it would be to subdue her, and she became curious about what life had in store for him. Back in the present, Layla's visit had finally come to an end, so she thanked everyone for their hospitality and pretended to bid Yuya goodbye. Obviously, that was just a farce because until Yuya lifted his summon, Layla couldn't return to the other side, so he would have to meet her back at the mountain where he summoned her. He had also warned her not to teleport when others were around, and not to stop for her parfait until she arrived at the mountain. However, Akin's eyes lingered on them even while Layla planted a kiss on Yuya's lips just to get the girl flustered. As she bid them goodbye, Akin unleashed her wrath on the poor guy, causing chaos while Layla laughed on her way out. Eventually, Layla returned to her original form and her world. But before her return, Yuya asked her why she kissed him, and she only said that if he enjoyed it, they could just move on. Also, he presented her with a box of parfaits because he had noticed how much she loved them. Subsequently, he asked her if she was trying to kill him to end his life, and she found it insulting that he wasn't even feeling honored to have his face buried in those glorious mountains. Also, Yuya showed her some parfaits he had kept for Mel and the others, begging her not to eat them before they arrived. Right as he was about to send her back, she asked him to summon her once a month or so. And he said he would certainly do so because he enjoyed hanging out with her. Meanwhile, in the kingdom of Arianas, Princess Mel took some time off work to enjoy the breeze and finish her work. But Layla approached her in her dragon form, and the guards went berserk. However, Layla transformed into a human form and said she was on an errand for Yuya. Thereafter, she brought out the sacred sword Yuya had forgotten to return and flung it almost like it was nothing. As Mel was shocked out of her senses because she couldn't believe that Layla met with Yuya, Layla even boasted of all sorts of things she had seen during her visit to Yuya, and later they were joined by Eris, who said she wanted them to converse somewhere more private while she reached out to Tia. Tia soon joined them, but Mel remained dazed and had to knock her back to her senses with a shoe. She was back again to the present, asking Layla if it was really true that she met with Yuya, so Layla said she would share it over snacks, particularly the parfait Yuya had sent them. The girls couldn't get over how delicious the parfaits were, and even planned to try recreating them. Suddenly, Tia and Mel were all wishing they were also Yuya's familiars so he would summon them. However, Layla told them that even though Yuya's abilities were formidable, she suspected that the goddess had pulled some strings, although they didn't know why. This meant the goddess was probably scheming to use Yuya again in some way. So Layla said that even though she may not compare to the gods, as long as their contract bound them together, she would know if something happened to her master. Mel asked if that meant there was a way she could see Yuya again. Layla said she felt it was possible because when summoners called their familiars to their side, the familiars sometimes brought other beasts that were near them at the time. And also, Yuya had promised to summon her to his world about once a month. This filled Mel's heart with joy, and it was so obvious that she missed Yuya terribly even though she denied it. However, the maid told her that her feelings for Yuya were as clear as daylight because Mel would sometimes get lost in daydreaming about Yuya while working, and she would lose herself whenever she heard his name. In that case, Layla offered that when things settled down in Yuya's world, she would ask for permission to bring the others along. However, her comforting words only made Mel more absorbed in her feelings for Yuya, and she soon passed out. Later, Yuya handed his mom an expensive-looking piece of jewelry, claiming he had made it with his hands. After spending 3 years on the other side and making it back to his world, he felt it was time to enjoy everything Japan had to offer. But as a broke boy, those were just dreams. He had his part-time job at the family restaurant, but it was barely sufficient to get him anything. Thanks to his magic, he could think of countless ways to make some quick cash, but he didn't want to do anything shady, so he had to come up with a new plan. It was then that he utilized his skill of transmutation and created some accessories, such as the one he made for his mom. The plan was to sell them online, using the gold, silver, and gems from his inventory. Also, since his mom said she had been suffering from shoulder and back pain, he used an enchantment and rejuvenation spell, embedding them into the piece of jewelry he got her. Later, his sister Ayumi returned home and saw the necklace he made for his mom, so she asked for one too, but asked him why he did that. So he shared that he thought he could make those and sell them online instead of just working. Ayumi told him that as long as he wasn't attaching a hefty price, the necklaces would definitely sell well. Yuya said he would set up a web shop and had tons of work to do, but Ayumi offered to help him too, and he said she would get a commission for every piece that was sold. She was fired up and ready for them to create a cool web shop and make bank until her mom reminded her that she had homework to do. Yuya's mom said she would be leaving earlier for work the following week, so she asked him to help her out as he always did, and he said he would surely do so and serve as her delivery boy. In no time, Yuya had resumed working to help his mom out and brought her lunch to the hospital where she worked. However, the nurse there happened to be starving and asked if he had any extra food. He told her the only food he had for her was his sausage, and there was enough for 5 people, so she could share it with the other staff. Soon, all the nurses had gathered around, eager to taste his food, so he used the opportunity to advertise his handmade jewelry. He also asked them for their opinions, and the girls immediately showed how stunned they were at the adorable pieces of jewelry. In fact, they said they would never have guessed the jewelry was handmade if he hadn't told them. He offered to let them have it for free, and the ladies were all excited. But there was one of them lurking from behind, a younger girl, and he got distracted looking out for her. He said he saw a girl watching them, and they explained that she had been transferred to their hospital from the junior ward and probably escaped from her room. One of the nurses offered to go looking for her, but Yuya, on his own, looked for her and found her, so he told her to return with him to meet the nurses. He told her they were all worried about her, and it was already getting cold, so they should head back, but the girl said she didn't want to. He said he would show her something cool in exchange for her agreeing to return afterwards, and they soon struck a deal. Thereafter, he put on a cute little magic show for her, playing with fireballs and throwing them all around. She asked him to do it again for her, so he promised to do so if she promised to remain a good girl and comply with the nurses. Thereafter, they sealed their agreement with a pinky promise. The next day, Yuya revisited the hospital and the nurses were all shouting, asking him what he did with the jewelry. So he was already wondering what had gone wrong, whether something had gone wrong with his enchantments, until the nurses confessed that their health had gotten much better ever since they wore it. Another one said her constipation and shoulder and back pain were gone, while another said she felt her makeup even looked better, all thanks to his jewelry. Yuya said that he had used some healing crystals to form the jewelry because he was imagining a long life, a long and prosperous life for his customers. Anyway, he said he'd like to visit the girl from last time, named Mia, and they led him to her room. But before then, they asked him what it was he needed, and he said he had bribed the girl with a magic trick, promising that if she remained a good girl listening to the nurses, he would return to play with her. Nurses were surprised and realized that that's why the girl had been listening so sweetly to everything they said. So they thanked him for going through all the trouble. However, he asked her why she was in that ward and not with others her age. So they explained that she had a fight with another kid, and if all the kids stopped playing with her, it wouldn't be good for her mental health. So rather than keeping her there, she was transferred to the surgical ward. Yuya was deep in thought when she somehow encountered a young boy who was also about to get into her room. The boy immediately ran away when he saw Yuya, but Yuya caught him and said it was time for them to chit-chat a little. He asked the boy why he wanted to see Mia, and the boy called him an old man, telling him to mind his business, and started crying like he wasn't the one who had issues. Yuya asked the boy whether it was he who Mia had a fight with, and he acknowledged that it was, because he had said something awful to her. He narrated that Mia's parents were usually too busy to visit her, and when the parents of her mates would show up to visit them, she would become so apprehensive and lash out. When Chino's mom paid him a visit with his favorite manga, Mia flung a teddy at him and acted rudely, so he told her that if he were her parents, he wouldn't ever visit her with that nasty attitude of hers. His careless statement made even his mom angry with him, and she told him to offer Mia an apology right away. However, he delayed and eventually asked the nurses for Mia's room number and was on his way to apologize to her when he bumped into Yuya. Lovingly, Yuya grabbed him and said he was going to help him out, so he showed up at Mia's room with him. Mia was initially excited to see Yuya, but the moment she saw Chino, the expression on her face changed. Both of them got into a stirring competition, and an awkward silence ensued before Chino eventually apologized for his role in the argument. Just then, Mia's mom walked in and Yuya introduced himself and also introduced the boy. He also told her the circumstances surrounding Chino and Mia, and she said she had heard about their fight and had personally come to the hospital to tender an apology on Mia's behalf and also make Mia apologize. Right there and then, she told Mia to apologize, and when the girl did, she told Yuya that it was time for him to keep to his own end of the bargain and perform his magic tricks. He began with a mini fireball display, which amazed all three of them and made Mia's mom question how he was doing it in the first place. Thereafter, he poured water into a bowl, created a blob, and splashed it on them, creating a mini fight between all of them. With Mia smiling so widely, her mom looked content, and for the last phase of Yuya's play, he asked Mia her favorite animal. She initially said her favorite animal was an isopod, a deep-sea creature, but since Yuya didn't even know what it looked like, he said the isopod was on strike. The girl next asked for a naked mole rat, but her mom begged her to at least pretend she was normal, even if everyone knew she wasn't. And finally, she asked for a kitty. So this was easy enough for Yuya, who just placed a marble under the handkerchief and swapped it with an object in his inventory, thereafter bringing out a kitty cat necklace. He did the same thing for Chino, but Mia's mom felt like the gift was too expensive. However, he told her the gifts were not expensive and he had made them himself, so he told her to choose something similar to her daughter's. When she did, she saw the joy on her daughter's face, and it warmed her heart. This was all part of Yuya's plan, knowing that even though the pendants couldn't cure Mia's disease, they would make her more resistant to other diseases. Now that her mother had a similar one, the girl would not be lonely anymore. Later, Mia's mom thanked Yuya and said that even though she had only seen magic tricks on TV, his own magic looked really real. She also said Mia looked happy, and that the last time the girl had smiled like that was before she was admitted to the hospital. Yuya himself noticed that Mia's mom, who initially looked like she just wanted to run and hide, now appeared much more relaxed, perhaps due to the rejuvenation magic, and he was glad he could help her in some way. The woman asked him if he could visit Mia after her surgery, as that would make the girl so happy, and he agreed. To Yuya, being able to use magic in modern Japan was a serious cheat code, but using the power he had for good was quite satisfying. While Yuya was spreading light wherever he went, some hoodlums were meeting up in their hideout, prepared with their arms to aim at a certain target. They prepared to take over the country because it was said to be a peaceful one, and their objective was to set up negotiations since there was plenty of support for struggling countries. However, they were going to try to avoid unnecessary massacres, although it was part of the plan to take human lives in the process still. Ultimately, they would kickstart the plan the following morning at a museum in Tokyo, with their target being the ambassador of a certain country, along with any Japanese government official. The next day, Yuya and one of his friends were busy cosplaying as superheroes, as it was a tradition for Yuya every summer and winter. The guy's name was Yusuke, who was a live-action otaku and was in the same department as Yuya at university. They had known each other since their early school years and had attended huge events every summer and winter, where the guy would pay Yuya to do cosplays for him. Because Yuya was pretty good at doing the superhero's lines so well, Yusuke was willing to pay him extra. Yuya had no choice because ever since Layla returned, he became even more broke than he already was, thanks to her endless perfume sprees. On top of that, he had a trip with his towering club during the summer break. Even though taking the job offer from Yusuke was bound to strip him of his aura and any form of riz, Yuya was willing to take it. While they were at it, they turned on the TV and on the news. It was announced that there were reports of reckless driving on the highways during the early hours of the night. The boys went on ignoring that and spoke about Ayumi. Yuya said Ayumi went out with Akin to a Persian exhibition. Just then, the news anchor announced that there was an explosion at the Tokyo Museum, after which several men with a foreign appearance entered the building carrying small arms. It was said that all visitors were taken hostage, among whom was the ambassador of a certain country and his delegates, together with the Japanese minister. Immediately, Yuya realized that that was where they were holding the Persian exhibition. So he instantly dialed Ayumi's number, but it was unreachable. Thankfully, on the news, there were said to be no confirmed casualties, but all visitors were taken hostage. Yuya's primary instinct was to find out whether Ayumi and Akin were alive by using magic, so even if they had been taken hostage, he would bring them home. However, he planned to hide his powers, so he was going to need some sort of disguise. He instantly remembered that he had a cosplay suit. Seeing Yusuke, he knocked him out with a little sleep spell and took the costume that he had made for him. Meanwhile, in the museum, among the hostages being held by the terrorists were Akin and Ayumi. Akin knew that if she had gone there with Yuya, things would have been different, although she wasn't sure he would have been able to stop the terrorists. Meanwhile, Yuya was flying to the museum in superhero style, although he wished he had teleported instead. However, he could only teleport to places where he had drawn a teleportation circle. For example, he had set up a circle on the rooftop of his university whenever he was late for class, but from there, he had to fly the rest of the way. In any case, he concealed his presence using his skill spell so no one would notice him flying up there, even though he might be spotted on a camera. He used his detection skill, and thanks to the enchanted necklaces he had given the girls, he realized he could track them down. The problem was now, even if he tried sneaking in with his concealed presence, it wouldn't give him full coverage, as that wouldn't work on people who were on high alert. In that case, he could only resort to using brute force because he had no skills related to espionage. By the way, he remembered that the terrorists had used explosives at the museum, so he detected the site of the explosives using his detection skill. He then located them, after which he placed a barrier on them. Since he had no disarming skills, he decided to hand it over to the police in a still concealed manner, and thereafter scanned the building for the presence of the terrorists. Firstly, there was a guy with a gun near an underground entrance, but there were no hostages on that floor. Next, there was one near the ground floor entrance and another in the middle of the showroom. There were some hostages on the side of the showroom wall, one more guy near the second floor entrance, and two more on the same floor. And that was where most of the hostages were, including Ayumi and Akin. Yuya sprang into action by silently arriving and dealing with one of the terrorists. He was able to do that easily without attracting attention because he had installed a soundproof barrier, so the guys on the other floors wouldn't notice what was going on. He spotted his next target and dealt with him just as he had dealt with the first one, and then placed his body in the same room with the other guy. Two of the terrorists were down, and four more were left. But the next part of the building was one that Yuya wasn't prepared for, as he saw a boy, and his family being targeted by one of the stupid terrorists. The poor boy was only trying to protect his mom and sister, but the insolent terrorist, with no shame, instantly squeezed and pulled the trigger, firing 2 bullets at the boy. However, Yuya protected the boy with a barrier and attacked the reckless fool immediately, disarming him of his weapon and rendering him unconscious. The boy saw Yuya as his superhero, and Yuya told him that he had done an excellent job protecting his family. Thereafter, he told the hostages on that floor that he had neutralized the terrorists on that floor and the floor below, so they could head downstairs, where they would be safe. Also, the police were on standby right outside the main entrance. Now, there was only 1 floor to conquer, and 3 terrorists remained. One of them was guarding the entrance, and there were about 100 people on that floor, meaning the terrorists' main target would be there, particularly the ambassador of a certain country and the Japanese minister. However, Yuya realized that the terrorists wouldn't be so reckless, thinking they could occupy the entire building with just a few men, so there was certainly a trick up their sleeves. Since there were hostages in the middle, it only meant there was a bomb somewhere in that bag, and the map kept popping in his head, making it easy for him to imagine the layout. First, he had to deal with the terrorists guarding the entrance, so he used his fingers to project slime onto the fool and used it to bind him. Thereafter, disarming him and kicking him, knocking him unconscious. Soon, he was left with the remaining 2 guarding the main target. The first one he dealt with was faster than the others, but it wasn't going to be an issue for Yuya, and in the end, he froze the terrorists' hands to the ground. The next idiot thought he had the Supreme card and held the remote of the bomb, which he immediately activated. But after clicking like an idiot and seeing that nothing happened, he realized he had been outsmarted, and Yuya immediately zapped the guy until he fell to the floor with a thud. Later, the ambassador's security showed up at the last minute to check on him, but Yuya told them to do as the civilians were told and head downstairs. As the people moved, it seemed Ayumi was staring right into his soul, but he convinced himself that she couldn't tell who he was thanks to his disguise. The police eventually arrived and asked Yuya whether it was he who took the terrorists out. He said he did and had neutralized them for his own reasons, but the head of the SWAT team asked him for his name. Yuya said he hoped they would only trust his appearance as a superhero and make them understand that he didn't want to reveal his identity for that reason. Besides, he picked up some things under a bench, which he believed were bombs, and asked them to handle them for him. He brought out the bombs, saying he had placed a barrier around them and destroyed the device that looked like a remote switch so they shouldn't explode. But the poor guys were scared for their lives. Later, the cops thanked him for his help, although they said he would have to follow them for questioning. He insisted that he would rather not and immediately vanished before them. His mission was accomplished, so he returned home to Sato's house thanks to the magic circle he had placed there. It had only been an hour, and wearing the suit was quite embarrassing, but Yuya knew he would never have made it to the museum without it, so he was thankful to his friend. The next scene showed Tia and Mel. Tia begged Mel to let her stay back and fight for the country, but Mel said there was no need for her to get involved, and that she should go and fight and find Lilda. Back in Japan, Yuya was asleep all day, and his sister had to wake him up. Obviously, he couldn't get over the cringe of his superhero status. The media didn't help, as they were talking about it day and night, rambling about a mysterious hero who popped out of nowhere and wiped the floor with the terrorists. All he could do was sit and watch in silence, observing the cringe of his existence. Most especially the super corny superhero moves that he had to do just to prove his point after defeating the terrorists. Everything made him want to crawl into a hole and stay there forever, and he had been feeling that way all week. Again that morning, the television still showed the so-called superhero, and Ayumi surprisingly said that the guy looked like Yuya in his cosplay attire. Later, Yuya's calendar reminded him of his meeting with Layla, which was when he realized it had already been a month since she left him, and it was time to summon her again. Ayumi asked if he had plans for the day, so Yuya told her that he planned to, but he forgot he had a meeting with Layla. She asked if Layla would be staying with them again, but he said that was unlikely to happen. Later in the day, Yuya summoned Layla again and said she had returned the sacred blade and had a surprise for him. To his utmost shock, Tia ran and hugged him, excitedly saying she missed him so much. Yuya was shocked, and Layla explained that Tia had visited Layla in her lair. Yuya expressed that while he was glad to see Tia, who had come all the way to see him, she couldn't just walk around like that in his world. She felt like she had done a bad thing, but he said that it was because of her appearance, especially her ears and tail, which gave her away as a beast woman, and there were no beast men in his country. Besides that, she had to acquire a birth certificate if she wanted to stay there, and even if he put her in his home, she would never be able to leave the house. Layla immediately said she could alleviate Tia's expression with her magic, and since the girl would not reside there forever, Yuya said it was okay, and Tia agreed, saying being able to see Yuya was good enough for her. Yuya asked Layla if she could hide Tia's ears and tail and transform her into a human, and Layla transformed herself into her own human form, and then said she would get right away to work. Afterwards, she transformed Tia into a more humanized version, making her thick in all the right places. Later, they all went on a ride, and both girls were surprised to find machines that could slide across the road. They went shopping for Tia, and she was so obsessed with the clothes and the beauty of the place. Layla, on the other hand, remained obsessed with her parfaits, and Tia joined her. However, Yuya was the one to pay for everything. Later, he had them rehearse their lines, telling Tia that she would introduce herself as Layla's half-sister, and say she was only there because Tia had been having trouble at home. And since Layla didn't know what to do, Layla met Yuya to help her. The backup plan was that if nothing worked out, then Layla would just use her magic to make everyone accept the story or forget it. Soon, it was the moment of truth, and they arrived at Yuya's house, where he was welcomed by his sister. Ayumi was surprised that her brother did not have just one but two pretty girls by his side, so she assumed he kidnapped them or forced them to hang out with him. At nightfall, while Yuya was doing the dishes, he was secretly grateful that things had gone according to plan because he had anticipated a disaster. But somehow, things were peaceful even though Ayumi wasn't entirely convinced. Later, when Ayumi went into the shower, Yuya asked Layla to tell him the truth about why Tia had come visiting. Layla said that Tia only wanted to see him, but he felt there was more to her visit and asked them to be transparent. Almost without her saying a word, he asked them what had happened to Mel. Because it was obvious, Tia didn't just up and leave when she headed over to Layla. Both girls were silent, and after a while, Layla eventually spoke up, saying Tia was ordered by Mel to stay with Layla so her survival would be ensured. Then they confessed that the Beals Empire was marching into the kingdom. This said empire had a very powerful military, and even when the Demon King was terrorizing Mel's kingdom with his forces, Beals' kingdom was in military conflict with its surrounding nations eager to expand their borders. However, they were happy to join forces against the evil god's army. The battle where the Ariana's kingdom and the Beals' kingdom stood side by side against the demon, and the evil god's army was not so long ago. Yet here they were demanding to attack the city of Ariana's and even capturing surrounding towns and asking them to surrender. The kingdom of Ariana's refused to surrender and requested support from neighboring towns. But even with their help, they couldn't defeat the Empire of Beals because their manpower had been significantly reduced after the battle against the evil god. As it stood currently, people were evacuating the kingdom of Ariana's, and that was why Mel instructed Tia to stay with Layla for her protection. Yuya was angry as he realized that it wasn't too long ago that humans battled against the evil god and had sacrificed so much to win the battle. This meant that the Beals' kingdom had been preparing for the moment the battle against the evil god was over, or, even worse, had been waiting for their moment to strike the Ariana's kingdom, and hadn't even lent their full power to fight the evil god. It pissed Yuya off to know that most of humanity's life was at stake in that battle. Yet the kingdom of Beals, the Empire of Beals, was plotting against the kingdom of Ariana's and giving half of their manpower. Layla noticed that he was losing his cool and told him to calm down. When he collected his thoughts, he asked her to take him back to Wilsteria. She outrightly said no because this battle was won among humans, and it wasn't in his place to meddle or to fight in someone else's war. Soon, Ayumi was out of the bathroom and walked in on them arguing, asking if they were fighting, but Yuya said there was no problem. However, Layla screamed that Yuya refused to share a bed with him, and so his sister said that he was a virgin and would probably die that way. Later, while the girls were busy having fun, Yuya was in distress thinking about the continent of Wilsteria. He knew the war was just another conflict on the continent, and that he was an outsider, so it wasn't his business. However, he still felt it wasn't right just to sit back. Besides, he knew that if he went there, he would be giving up his life in Japan, which he had worked so hard to come back to, so he was torn in two. He thought deeply, realizing that even though he had asked Layla to take him and she had refused, making it to the continent wasn't a problem for him. The reason Tia was there today was because she was in contact with Layla the moment Layla was summoned, causing Tia to be summoned as well. That meant that when Yuya sent Layla back while he was in contact with her, she would take him with her to the other side. The real problem now was how he was going to return to Japan, because the last time, it was the goddess who summoned him to the other side, and she was the one who sent him back after he fulfilled his purpose. But now that he was going of his own free will, he wasn't sure the goddess could help and would have to figure something out. Somehow, he had an idea in his head, but he had to test it out, and if it eventually worked, he had to brace himself to jump into the mess. In the morning, Yuya went out for a walk with Akin and her dog, Elizabeth. Usually, Yuya would run into her during his morning workouts, but on that day, he was doing it purposefully. Somehow, this granted Akin the chance to ask him how things were going with Layla, and the fact that she knew he had brought another cute girl into the house with him. But he shamefully told her that his sister was hosting the girls, not him. Akin said she got to see him that day, so she didn't mind and was happy. And then she said she was going to get some drinks. As she left them, Yuya told her dog to accompany him somewhere. Much later in the evening, the scene had changed, showing Yuya with Layla and Tia, whom he had woken up late at night. He told them he was going back to Wilsteria to stop the war between the Empire and the Kingdom. He agreed that, as Layla said, he had no right to stick his nose in that business because he was an outsider, but he owed a debt to all the people who helped him, especially the royal family, and as such, he couldn't sit back doing nothing while the Empire attacked them. Layla asked him if he was sure of his choice, because he had worked so hard to find his way back home to Japan, yet here he was throwing himself into battle once more. She asked him how he planned to return home from Wisteria, because he obviously didn't plan to leave Japan forever. He concurred with her, saying he definitely had to return because he had exams in a month, and it was 2 weeks until the exam date. Even though he knew he couldn't end the war in such a short time, he at least wanted to put a wrench in the Empire's invasion. Layla asked him to reconsider so she could assist the kingdom in his place, because all she needed to do to help was rip the Imperial army to shreds and derail their machinations. He thanked her for saying it, for offering to fight, but adding that there was more to his involvement, because he wasn't looking for a fight but felt it was the right thing to do. However, the question remained of how he would return to Japan, given that the goddess wasn't going to help him this time around. But he told her that he had a plan. She was able to bring Tia because they were in physical contact, so he forged a familiar contract with an animal in his world that he would summon to the other side. It was none other than Elizabeth, Akin's huge dog, whom he had successfully forged a contract with and even teleported together with. Layla would rather discourage him, but Tia said she was happy as long as she was beside him. Even though the kingdom had so many people she loved, if she had to choose between all of them, she would still choose Yuya. But if she didn't have to choose, then she would like to save everyone. In the end, Layla herself had to succumb as it was 2 against 1, and so she permitted Yuya to do as he pleased. He immediately started planning when he would leave, and said they would depart the following day, after which he would tell Ayumi and his mom that he was going on a trip. Meanwhile, in Ariana's kingdom base, the Crown Prince Leon noted that they had been able to muster some forces. The captain of the Royal Knights, General Regin, informed him that the Imperial forces had gathered in the Western Plains, and they would likely launch an attack the next day, in the afternoon or the day after, with their 80,000 men. As the vice-captain broke down the formation of the other staff, another soldier came to inform Leon that some guests from the eastern city-state had arrived. He welcomed them nicely, and the leader of the other country's delegation said they didn't mind helping because they knew that if they didn't stop the Empire's invasion, they would be the next on the chopping block. The same thing was said and affirmed by the other cities, who apologized for being unable to gather as many men as would have been helpful. But Leon told everyone that they would soon put an end to the Empire's madness, and they were expecting an attack on the morrow. He explained that the strategy was to bear the brunt of the Empire's assault while retreating along the highway in the hope of reducing the Empire's resources. However, Leon said that their forces outnumbered them, so getting flanked was considerable. However, the leader of the other country said that whatever they lacked in numbers, they would make up for it in grit, and if each one of their own men took down 3 of theirs, the day would be theirs. Compared to the battle against the evil god's army, their chances of victory against this empire were high. However, the national head sorcerer requested that the leader of the other country stay clear of the front lines because the fate of their kingdom was intertwined with his fate. He also advised Leon that if anything went wrong, he should abandon them to fight so he could live to fight another day. However, Leon said the kingdom was in good hands because his sister Mel was still alive and his dad was still in great health, so he would risk his life like every other man who was going. Just then, an urgent report came to him that a winged monster was approaching from the east, and they couldn't identify it yet, so they wanted him to evacuate. Many of them wondered whether it was a wyvern, but Leon soon recognized that it was a dragon, and they commanded everyone to get into defensive positions. But to his utmost shock, it was just Layla arriving with Tia, Mel, and Yuya. Earlier, before Yuya and the girls arrived, he had tried explaining to his mom and sister why he had to leave, using the excuse that Layla and Tia had to return for a family emergency. As a friend of the family, he was asked to follow them as a mediator. However, that wasn't convincing enough, so his mom told him to be accountable for his actions and promise not to make any trouble for the family, because she trusted him. She asked him when he'd be back, and he said he'd return in a week because he had exams and couldn't stay for so long. After saying their goodbyes, Yuya and the girls arrived at Wisteria. The first thing he did was consider what the next step was. He said they should first head for the capital, and Layla offered to teleport them to the city's outskirts, after which she'd fly them to the palace. Yuya knew she was doing far more than she should for him, but she told him that she was merely assisting her master, to whom she was bound by a contract. She had no resistance to the idea of smashing some skulls along the way. After teleporting to the city's outskirts, Layla took them to the palace, and when they arrived, Yuya surprised everyone with his presence and requested an audience with the king. Thereafter, they rushed to notify him immediately. In no time, Mel came out excitedly, together with Eris, and hugged him, squeezing him so tight that he released some. Ares was glad to see him but threatened that he would have to satisfy her before returning to his country. Soon, Yuya was informed that the king was ready to receive him, so Mel led him to the audience chamber, where he met both her parents and bowed before them. However, they told him he didn't have to, and he apologized for dropping by unannounced, sharing that Tia had told him that there was a fool on the continent who had a foolish idea and was now doing foolish things. So he showed up to teach them a lesson, and that it would be his honor to join their kingdom in the war against the Empire. The king was glad to see that they would be pleased to have Yuya on their side, but one idiot, the Minister of Internal Affairs named Bel, said that the outcome of the conflict would determine the fate of their kingdom. Yuya was fed up with the idiot because this dude was a trusted royal advisor and the most powerful man in the kingdom, who had a spotless reputation, because he had built orphanages for children who lost their parents in the war with his money. The man had done absolutely nothing wrong, but he never approved of Yuya as an outsider jumping in to solve a national crisis, and he showed his disgust every time they ran into each other. Something seemed different this time around, though. Bel continued saying that in the battle against the evil god, Yuya had been summoned by the divine goddess, but currently that wasn't the case, and it would be foolish of them to trust someone who wasn't from their own world. The king said Bel was just being stubborn as ever and that he sympathized with his opinion. But as things stood, many would lose their lives, and in light of the need, the hero, Yuya, had volunteered to join their cause. Therefore, he ordered the minister to show some restraint. Coincidentally, and at the weirdest moment, Bel's hair suddenly disappeared, all thanks to Yuya's curse that he had placed 2 years ago when the guy was on his nerves. He actually cursed Bel, saying he would lose 1 hair for every 100 steps he took, and that was why the dude was bald. In any case, the king affirmed that it seemed Bel could no longer object, So he informed Yuya that they had received some men from the eastern city-states and a volunteer army of adventurers and mercenaries who set up camp in the east part of the plains. They expected an attack in the coming days, so the king wanted Yuya to join the encampment, and Yuya said he would depart as soon as possible. Confidently, Mel said she wished to go because she knew that if Yuya was joining them in battle, then their chances of victory were higher, and by accompanying Yuya, she could help further lower the casualties. She went on to say that they had some pretty solid people in play, such as her own brother, the vice captain, with Mel, Yuya, Tia, and Layla, which meant the heroes' party would be reunited once more and boost everyone's morale. With that, her father's confidence was gained, and he ordered Mel to accompany Yuya and lend her strength to Leon and his army. Yuya promised to bring them good news in the next coming days, and the king thanked him not only for helping this time around, but also for what he had accomplished the last time. However, he emphasized that Yuya shouldn't overstress himself on their account. Those were the events leading up to the time Yuya joined the prince at his camp. So when Leon saw Yuya, he expressed his surprise at Yuya's appearance while Yuya delivered a handwritten message to Leon from the king stating that Yuya was to join their war effort. With that, Leon thanked him and said they would now have to adjust their strategy. Before anything began, the prince asked Yuya if he was completely sure he wanted to join them in battle, and if Layla also wanted to be a part of it. However, so Yuya said that Layla wasn't there to fight necessarily, but was going to assist in any way she could. Yuya asked for more details about the current status of their battle, especially on the enemy's side and strategies. So Layla told him that the royal army had 20,000 men, but totaled about 40,000 with reinforcements, as against the 80,000 men in the empire, making them greatly outnumbered. Yuya planned to do everything within his power, but knew that they were obviously at a disadvantage, and he couldn't make up for the difference of over 20,000 men. Typically, Yuya could wipe out the entire army in one go with a single spell, but he had exhausted such single-spell skills during his battle against the Demon King and the Evil God, so their only hope was a waterproof strategy. Leon shared that based on the location of the Imperial Army, they believed they would use a crescent moon vanguard with light cavalry on the right, heavy cavalry on the left, and infantry and heavy cavalry at the center, with the commanders and service corps behind the front line. They expected the Empire to crash into them with their heavy cavalry at the center, while their right wing circled to cut off their path of retreat. Then the heavy cavalry in the left wing will divide their forces, at which point the infantry in the center vanguard will join the three. Yuya wasn't surprised at the simple formation, because the Empire's army was huge in number, and any complex formation could cost them by creating confusion among the ranks. Ideally, Yuya would prefer to surround them from all sides to wipe them out, but it wasn't realistic to think of that with the difference in their numbers, and since they had set up camp in the open, the Imperial army would see them coming from miles away. Now that Yuya was in the picture, Leon asked him if he had any suggestions for a new strategy because they had earlier planned on fighting without him. Yuya said their priority should be to end the battle as soon as possible, since they were outnumbered, and then, since they were recovering from the previous war, they should limit the number of casualties. Without him saying anything, it was obvious that Yuya was pulling a Fort Galdas again. Fort Galdas was a fort that served as a foothold for the Demon King's army when they attacked the south. Whenever they wiped out the army, they would retreat to the fort in the valleys between the mountains, regroup there, and come at them again in full force. Aside from Layla and Kadru, Yuya had contracts with 2 other familiars. One of them could command any small rodents in the area, so they used that to summon a type of bug, but in billions. One of the commanders recounted how Yuya had used the fort to defeat thousands of the Demon King's army with his magic, rendering the fort unusable while traumatizing the soldiers so much that over a fifth of them deserted them. This was all accomplished by using summons, but obviously in billions of numbers. However, Yuya told them all that he won't do it again because there was no time or even space for that. He asked who was leading the adventurers, and they told him it was an A-rank party whose operations were based in the kingdom, so he asked them to call them over. In the meantime, he had some ideas and asked if the prince was willing to listen to them, giving him a piece of paper where he had written a plan to keep the casualties low, while simultaneously creating an opening in the imperial forces. All Yuya wanted to know was whether they would have enough time to prepare. So the prince said the royal and allied sorcerers would back up the adventurers, and if they started preparing right away, then the engineers and earth mages would get a few hours of rest before the battle began. If all went well according to plan, the prince, Leon, was confident that Yuya's plan would greatly help them on the battlefield. Thereafter, Yuya assigned Mel to be his assistant and to support the adventurers, while Layla would deal with the light cavalry, taking out the commanders at the center of the army. As for Tia, she would ride with Layla and point her towards important-looking people. Layla asked why he wasn't just letting her destroy the entire main force of the enemy. So Yuya told her that the battle was between the kingdom and the empire, and as a hero who served the kingdom before, he had his reasons. But a dragon who normally wouldn't interfere with humans playing a major role in the conflict would cause all sorts of problems. So he would like her to play more of a supporting role. The prince backed what Yuya was saying by saying that, truly, if Layla got involved in the fight, it would cause more countries to invade them sooner or later. For that reason, he would rather he and his forces stick to their initial decision to fight to the death and conquer against all. While he was still talking, he was informed that some members of a party named Fangs of the Minotaur had arrived. They introduced themselves to each other and all stated their names, inspired by the OGs of Cornhub. So even when they were excited to see Yuya again, he instantly told them they were fired because their entire party was wrong on so many levels. He told them he had an important task for them and shared the plans. So the leader of the party agreed thatonly they could pull it off and told Yuya that they could count on him. The day of the battle eventually arrived, and it was noon, but it was so cloudy that the sun wasn't visible. There was also no wind, so the perfect conditions to make their plan a success were already set. Since they were already south of the Imperial army, Yuya used his skill to conceal their presence and wait. He could see the enemy formation from where he was, because from the front they looked disciplined and put together, but soldiers were still moving back and forth at the rear, as they were trying to make preparations to launch their attack first thing on the morrow. However, when they saw that Yuya's forces were mobilizing, they scrambled into position, underprepared. Things were all going according to plan, but since they were south, they weren't going to wait until the enemy was ready. Otherwise, their plan might not work. Eventually, every one of them agreed that it was time, and all that was needed was Yuya's word to kickstart everything. After reminding everyone of their roles, Yuya brought out the items he had packed with him from Japan, including his bike. He also brought a chainsaw and some other tools to vent his anger on the Imperial army. With Mel on his bike, it was time for him to start his own role in the battle. On the other hand, Leon seemed nervous, and Lance told him that if he was already this nervous, he would only live for as long as he lasted in bed. However, he had no need to worry because with Yuya's help, there was no chance they would lose. However, Leon said he wasn't worried about losing the battle. He noted that Lance had spent quite a bit of time with Yuya and seemed to trust him an awful lot, but Lance denied trusting Yuya, saying that he only knew that Yuya was a good fighter. But his personality was somewhat disagreeable. On the other hand, Yuya was only watching out for the Imperial heavy cavalry to make their move, so the kingdom's forces would halt them and stop and hold position. If both armies charged at full speed, they would clash in a matter of minutes. But if they stayed put and let the Imperials go to them, they would buy some time, and it was all up to them. He then activated the barrier over his bike and ran straight into the Imperial army, pushing them out of the way, one after the other. At the same time, Mel dropped explosives left, right, and center, dispersing them and causing chaos. The men were thrown into disarray and were losing their minds, attacking their own selves. So that was the first part of their plan in action, and then the royal army of Arianas stepped in. Yuya devised a plan to completely halt the heavy cavalry of the Imperial army. This was achieved through running his bike through a couple of men, and even though the number wasn't substantial enough, it gave Mel enough distance to throw the harmless firecrackers around. These were not explosives that would take the lives of the soldiers immediately, but rather distort the sense of balance of their horses, since horses would be susceptible to light flashes and sudden loud sounds. As a result, the horses of the heavy cavalry were thrown into confusion, and the cavalry was mobilized, creating the perfect opening for the forces of Ariana's kingdom to strike. The next phase of the plan was carried out by adventurers and the sorcerers, especially the sorcerers who bathed the Imperial army in blood with hot water. In the midst of all of this, Mel stopped by to attend to some of their wounded soldiers and healed their injuries using her light magic. Afterwards, it was time for Layla and Tia to kickstart their own port. Obviously, Tia looked distraught and anxious, so Layla had to calm her down. The poor girl was glad that she was finally getting back at the Empire. This was because she lost her parents as slaves, who died as slaves, and she almost had to become a slave by herself, as the Empire was the only nation that hadn't abolished slavery. So it was no surprise to Layla that Tia was quite excited, not to mention that she was eager to please Yuya by doing a good job. Layla transformed into her dragon form, and Tia hopped on her back. Layla's sudden appearance terrified the soldiers, as the last thing they had expected to see was a black dragon. She roared and exhaled a gush of air that blew away some of the forces. A few fools thought it was smart to shoot their arrows at her, but to Layla, it felt as though they were only shooting cotton balls. Tia kept her eyes peeled to find the commander of the squadron and eventually noticed a man directing a section of the army. Immediately, she pointed in his direction, telling Layla to take him down first. Will the girls successfully play their role in the battle against the Empire, and will Yuya lead them to victory? If you're eager to see how this plays out in Part 2, type the name of the manga's hottest girl in the comment section. If you enjoyed the video, give a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for similar content. As always, thanks for watching.